That's great. Well, thank you very much indeed to three presenters for putting together the presentations for us today. I wonder if they might like to now turn their mics and cameras back on again. Very much welcome questions if you have any. In the meantime, I was going to ask quite a general question, actually. We've talked about what's going on in terms of the governance as it's situated and what may or may not happen moving forward. I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit yourselves on how you would hope to see Marine Cloud Brightening governance, the debate about the governance, as well as the governance itself, how you might like to see it evolve and how you think it will evolve going forward.
I think you'll have to pick on one of us.
I'm going to pick on you, John. So I'm going to pick on you.
Well, I think slowly would be my answer to that. I think that the discussions of the governance and the knowledge of the science need to progress side by side. I don't think it's satisfactory for to research the science to death and not think about the governance, or indeed to agonize over how we're going to govern something before we even know whether it will work or what its properties are. So I would say in parallel and communicating with each other, the major disciplines involved, and progressively, because it's there are a lot of questions on both sides that are not going to be answered quickly. And Maria mentioned that there may need to be changes to the international organizations, to their remits involved. That takes many years to negotiate, in the same way that scientific research takes many years. So, progressively and slowly, I think would be nice. I know we have a climate crisis which is building up, but we can't afford to take precipitate action. It would be a big mistake to dive in and do something that may have very unexpected consequences until we're really very confident about how it's going to work.
Thanks. Anna Maria, did you want to chip in?
Sure. I mean, I agree with everything John said. I guess I would add, I would love to see it evolve in a way that is not relegated to experts like us, but also involves a robust societal conversation and debate. And this includes, and this might be a tall order, given the range of conspiracy theories and ideas out there right now relating to science and technology, but I would love it if it were an informed debate that was iterative over time, so it took place back and forth with the researchers.
Before I go to Daniel, can you say a little bit about how that informed plural conversation might actually happen? How does that get energized? By whom?
Well, this is a bit outside of, I guess, my formal training as a legal scholar, public international legal scholar, but yeah, we do have mechanisms in the law, for example, through and also obligations in treaties and other soft law instruments calling for example, access to information, and this can extend, at least in principle, to also access to information about science and emerging technologies. And so there's an evolving conversation about the role of human rights in guaranteeing citizens access to information about science and technology, especially those that have the potential to impact their lives in various ways. And so there are these kinds of mechanisms that could evolve, but I would say they're pretty thin on the ground at present. And so we've seen some researchers in this area try to engage with some form of consultations, for example, putting up calls for comments on their websites about proposed experiments, but so probably falls short of where we want to be, though it's a starting point.
Okay, thanks. And so then on back to Daniel for the question. Then the how would you like to see it evolve, the governance of MCP?
I think that there's fairly large differences, I guess, in how you can get society and the public involved in the international governance issues as opposed to the more localized governance issues. At the moment, we're quite concentrated on the localized governance issues, and even that's quite a challenge. But how I'd like to see the conversation progress, I think, is trying to involve the public as much as possible and stakeholders as well in the science. You know, and so we're trying to do that. We're working really quite hard on that in Australia at the moment, engaging with traditional owners as well as stakeholders on the reef, as well as with the wider Australian public, because ultimately, if there's not that social buy-in, then it's very unlikely, you know, no matter what the science finds, for it to be, you know, an actual viable intervention on the reef, and that goes for all of the things that we're looking into. And I think globally it probably has to proceed somewhat on the same basis. And I think it's actually useful there that we are starting to progress the science a little bit more out of the lab and into the field, even though it's a very small scale, because I think that does help to prompt the conversation. And I think without that, then things, as John mentioned, can move very slowly. But I think without that sort of slowly pushing forward, things can move at a glacial pace, because the impetus to make these decisions, which are not easy, just isn't there. Otherwise, it's too much of an academic debate.
Well, thanks, Anna Maria.
Yeah, I think this is, I mean, I've heard this kind of comment before, but I think it's sort of a false distinction that's presented in terms of what's local, and we need to start local and then consider international implications at a different time frame and scale. And I think a lot of the public engagement studies have shown that the public do express concern about, for example, the international implications of the development of these technologies right from the outset. They also express concern about the ethics of intervening and modifying the environment, including at small scales. And so I think it presents a false picture to say governance should involve, you know, what the local population thinks about the very minor implications of research at this time, versus having an imagination of what these technologies entails in a more robust conversation now that anticipates how we might engage in governance all along the way.
But that, of course, makes it a very difficult challenge. If you move from local conversation, local engagement about local projects to scale into some kind of global conversation, how you go about doing that is really challenging, isn't it?
Well, I mean, much of the governance we've seen so far is that regulation has taken place already at the international level first. And so it's also possible to have these conversations on a more general, abstract level, talking about what first principles should guide us and frame how we research these kinds of interventions in the environment. And so, yeah, as I said, I think there's no like clear rationale for starting small and local and then developing the international conversation. I think we can have these conversations at different levels in parallel and are seeing that. I think to not have the global conversation or the conversation about the long-term implications of these technologies ignores what the public say they care about in many instances, and also sort of bears the risk of not considering the full picture of what these technologies entail based on what we know already.
Okay, thanks. I was just thinking, Daniel, you've had the experience of doing this. You've been not international conversations, but you've been talking to Indigenous communities, local peoples about what's happening. There have been consultations more broadly about the RAP project. Often in these experiments, people who are oceanographers, physical scientists, are suddenly being told, oh, you should go and talk to people and engage and do this deliberative stuff, and have no idea what it actually means. What's it been like as a researcher to actually do this? What was the experience like of engaging with people?
I think it's very positive, because I think that the general public in particular, if you talk about marine cloud brightening, the scenarios that they imagine are very far removed from what the proposal actually entails. And so getting out amongst the community and putting yourself in front of them and answering their questions, you know, it can change things very dramatically. And this even applies to the regulators too. You know, we did a workshop where we invited all of the regulators within Australia that have an interest in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And so that's the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, the federal government Department of Environment and Heritage, the office of the government in Australia that's responsible for regulating gene technologies. And so, as well as Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service. And so we had a workshop with all of these regulators. And, you know, at the start of them, I asked, you know, what's the most startling idea, you know, that worries you the most of all of the different things that we're looking at in the Reef Restoration Adaptation Program? And they all said cloud brightening. And at the end of the workshop, I asked them again, and none of them said cloud brightening. They all said, oh no, cloud brightening is not that scary at all. We're more worried, I won't dob in any other of the technologies, but we're all worried about X more than the cloud brightening now. And so I think just getting the information on a first-hand basis makes such an incredibly important difference to people's perception of what the issues actually are.
Okay. That's interesting. Thank you very much. Well, we've only got 2 minutes left in our slotted, a new word, allotted time. So I just wonder if you would each like to give the last few reflections on what you've heard and your thoughts about the future agenda. I'm going to turn to John to start with that.
Well, I would say we need more knowledge, because we are at present still in a state of very considerable ignorance and uncertainty about marine cloud brightening among all the climate intervention techniques. And I personally prefer to take decisions based on a reasonable level of knowledge rather than in ignorance. So I think we need to progress, as I said, by developing our knowledge through research and through deliberative studies, and you know, what do people think, what does the technique do, and proceed steadily and not get ahead of ourselves. And but we need more knowledge about people and what people think about things, and we also need to spread knowledge, because at the moment, all of this stuff is being discussed primarily among people, experts in a handful of countries. And the process of extending any knowledge at all about what marine cloud brightening or any of these techniques involves to a much wider cross-section of the population is a very big challenge indeed. But I think we need to do that before we start asking people to decide whether they like A or B, and what is their preferred option. You can't make those sorts of decisions unless you have a fairly good understanding of what's being talked about.
Thank you. It's knowledge, caution, and communication. Anna Maria, I'll turn to you next and give Daniel the last word.
We have almost a decade of social science and humanities research on some of the implications of the development of solar modification technologies like cloud brightening, marine cloud brightening. And I think we can walk into this situation with our eyes wide open. So I agree that we do need to develop more knowledge, but it should be done in an ethical and responsible way. And included in this, I think, is a more robust conversation about the role of different actors in facilitating that conversation. So, for example, what are the implications of scientists advocating and leading different aspects of these research projects, including leading the public engagement part, and what are the implications for public trust in the science? So I think, yeah, given the number of controversies we've seen in climate and other areas of emerging technologies, I think it makes sense to have a really robust, informed conversation that involves different sectors of society and kinds of expertise.
Okay, thank you. And Daniel, you have the last word.
I think it seems pretty well covered to me, but look, from my perspective, being an engineer and a scientist, I do feel that we can be getting a bit ahead of ourselves. I think that developing the science far enough to know whether cloud brightening could even realistically feasibly be scaled up to the size of the reef is we're a very long way from even knowing that yet. And so I think premising the conversation on the presumption that this is something that is going to be able to be carried out at a globally relevant scale, is a little bit dangerous in a sense as well, because perhaps it's useful from an academic point of view, but we really don't know yet whether it is scalable. And I think it's going to be an immense challenge to scale it large enough to make a difference on the reef. And I think at the moment, being able to scale up this technology to produce enough cloud condensation nuclei to make a difference at a global scale is really quite an uncertain objective fairly far in the future. We're a long way from knowing that, I think.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So it's fascinating insights from all three of you. We've come to the end of our time now, so I'm just going to say thank you to the three presenters. Thank you for your time and your contributions. They're very much appreciated. The conversation goes on cautiously, carefully, with new information and knowledge coming in, hopefully, as we move forward, perhaps research funding to help that. So we'll come to an end now. We'll draw the conversation to a close, and I wish you all the best for the coming festival, and see you again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.